지금부터 첫 번째 특별 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 특별 세션은 성공에 필요한 21세기 직무 능력 그리고 중국의 보이지 않는 혁신이라는 주제로 진행되겠습니다. 좌장으로는 강성모 카이스트 총장님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 강성모 총장님 진행 부탁드립니다.
Good morning. I think we will run this session in English. So if later, if you do have question, I would appreciate if you ask in English. So the way we organize this session is, as you know, in total 90 minutes. So we have a first speaker speaking 35 minutes, a second speaker another 35 minutes. So we'll have two speakers speaking first. And then rest 20 minutes, we have a Q&A session open for your Q&A. We will collect your questions in writing, and then they will hand over to me. But we also welcome questions from the audience, direct questions. So since time is short, and we have many important topics to be discussed, I will be brief in my introduction of speakers. So before that, just a few minutes of remarks. I think in global human resource, that's what you are here for, and you'll be wanting to become a global human resource person and a leader, which promotes open innovation and collaboration and cooperation across national and cultural boundaries. And also we share the common mission for global sustainability of nature, harmony, and peace. So how do we get there? And in this session, two excellent speakers will provide answers, hopefully, for you. And you can challenge them by asking good questions. So first speaker is Mr. Jake Schwartz, who is the CEO of General Assembly. I thought it was a National Assembly, like filled with the Congress people, but this is an educational organization, and you will be quite interested in what Jake does. He has undergraduate education in American Studies at Yale University, and he had lots of things he did over several years before getting back to Wharton School of Business, where he got an MBA, and then he founded this company. So let's hear from Jake. Let us welcome him. Yes.
Hello, and it's wonderful to be here in Korea. It's my first time ever in Korea. It's very exciting to be with you, and I'm really happy to get to share with you a little bit about General Assembly. I think you'll find that what we do has special application for the kind of problems that this Global Human Resources Forum has been designed to address, and hopefully this can inspire new ideas and perhaps new ways of thinking about education and the world of work. So just a little bit of a primer on where General Assembly started. It really has its core in some of the dysfunction of the higher education system in the United States. A lot of people think of the universities of the United States as the envy of a lot of the world. Harvard is used as a synonym for the most elite of universities. But underneath the surface, there are a lot of ways the system works that were not quite logical. So right now, our government is sitting on over $1.1 trillion of subsidized student debt, mostly due to the fact that through their subsidies and their encouraging of certain types of educational consumption, more people have gotten educated, but what that has led to is a massive inflation in the cost of tuition. Tuition in 2- and 4-year degrees in the United States has gone up faster than healthcare, at almost 5% a year. Meanwhile, universities have been built on a legacy cost infrastructure that required that increase in prices year in and year out. Again, they are organizations that have gotten very used to a certain type of inflationary environment. And moreover, because they have been focused on being research institutions as the most aspirational form of education, they are governed primarily by their faculty, which creates all sorts of other conflicts when it comes to creating programs that have deliver good value for the students as opposed to are convenient for what the faculty would like to teach. Like many other developed nations around the world, our graduates are incredibly overeducated and underemployed. 40% of recent college graduates report being in jobs that don't actually require a 4-year degree, and less than 30% report being in jobs that are directly related to what they studied in college. And of course, employers, which in some ways are the most overlooked part of the educational ecosystem, spend over $200 billion annually in talent acquisition and internal training. In some cases, mostly, I believe, to repair and fix the problems of the rest of this ecosystem. To put it in context, $200 billion in the US is more money than the federal government spends on higher education subsidies. So, GA is in many ways designed to fix parts of this by bringing these stakeholders together and serving each of these stakeholders in meaningful ways. Our real concept is return on investment, meaning that the amount of time and money you put into your education, and we as members of society put into society's education, should have a return commensurate with that cost. By focusing on shorter time periods, more relevant skills, and lower cost, with clear outcomes in the world of work, we are able to create a much, much higher return on investment profile for our educational programs, which is exhibited by the fact that government is incredibly interested and supportive of what we do, by the fact that employers and students are actively pursuing what we do as partners and as customers, and of course by the fact that we place 99% of our full-time students in the fields that they study within 100 days of graduation. General Assembly, in many ways, is not a new idea. This is vocational training for the 21st century. But by focusing on in-demand skills, things like data science, mobile and web development, digital marketing, user experience design, we are able to create a more aspirational model of vocational training. And we do it all in the context of incredibly well-designed, aspirational community spaces like this one pictured here, which is in San Francisco, which attracts an entire generation of college graduates, millennials who are seeking a different type of approach to their career and work. We also are unique in the world of innovative education companies in that we still are incredibly vocal proponents of offline education. We use online constantly. We use software to find our students, prepare our students, evaluate our potential students, and often deliver content instead of textbooks. We do not have textbooks in our programs. And we also use software to keep the network of our alumni strong well after they've graduated the program and are on their way in their own careers. But we believe that offline is in many ways a much more economical way to deliver the true value propositions of education, which is not just content. What education's value proposition is around a social experience, access to mentorship and a personal transformation, and of course outcomes and success on the other end. That is why we spend money and time on education, not because of content. And it is very important to keep that in mind as you build educational programs. So that defines our vision and mission for General Assembly. Our vision is a global community of individuals empowered to pursue work they love. We have campuses, 9 of them in the United States, including New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Seattle, and more. We are in London, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, and Melbourne, with more to come. And we do, in every one of these campuses and around the world, we deliver best-in-class practical education in technology, business, and design. We provide access to opportunities for our community that build skills, confidence, and freedom in one's career. And we do this all in the context of a global network of participants who are mutually invested in each other's success. That's our vision, and that is our mission. So, we have 14 campuses around the world on 4 continents, over 100 classrooms. We've grown incredibly fast in only 5 years since our founding, and really 4 years since our launch. Our programs are primarily full-time and part-time programs, about 3 months in length. We focus on web development, like I said. We just announced a very exciting partnership with Google to build the only official Android development program, immersive program. UX design, which is our second most popular and fastest growing area, focused on design thinking, consumer-focused thinking, and problem solving, product management, data science, digital marketing, all of the skills that are required, not just for startups, but for any company that wants to make a shift in the digital transformation of the 21st century. All of our courses are taught by practitioners. This is incredibly important. Academics is amazing. Theory is great. But that is not why our students come to us. They come to learn from people in the field, solving the real-world problems that you face every day when you're trying to do stuff in the real world. That is the focus of our programs. We're currently graduating over 4,000 students each quarter. Next year, we will graduate over 25,000 students around the world. And like I said, we maintain our outcomes rate of 99%. Within 180 days of graduating by focused on relevant skills and delivering best-in-class practical education. Over time, we believe one of the big opportunities we are building is a true global alumni network. By 2018, we will have over 140,000 alumni of our programs. These are people under the age of 40 focused on the most fast-growing and hottest industries in the hottest cities around the world, in the most upwardly mobile part of their career. This is incredibly powerful, not only because it supports our business model by having a community that can continue to come back and participate in General Assembly, but it also encourages new students to come to General Assembly to join this global network and be part of a powerful professional network that is truly global in its scope. We've also launched the GA Credentialing Network, which is a giant consortium of world-class employers who are working with us to build standards and assessments around these 21st century skills, where there is currently a lot of opacity and a muddiness to definitions around what certain levels of skills are for web development, for digital marketing. And we are seeing incredible response from companies like PayPal, General Electric, Bloomberg, Microsoft, L'Oreal, Google, and many more. Of course, because we are an education to employment company, we don't just focus on education, we also focus on employment. And that has led us to have a very fast-growing and incredibly exciting B2B business serving large enterprises by helping them build capabilities inside their corporations around these core 21st century disciplines. It allows them to build a shared vocabulary and understanding of the changes that are happening in their industry and how they can innovate to not only survive in this new world, but also thrive in it. We work with, we work with many, many companies, some of the best-known Fortune 500 companies who continue to come back to General Assembly to build capabilities for their staff, hire new candidates for their teams, and overall maintain their relevancy in the 21st century. That program is blended online, offline to allow for both high levels of engagement from executives and managers, while online allows for wide levels of participation. Our engagement rates, by the way, are 5 to 6 times higher than typical online-only platforms for delivering corporate education. We focus on these key areas like digital marketing, data analytics, product management, and leadership in the digital age. We've already been used by 10,000 executives and managers from over 50 Fortune 500 companies. We've delivered workshops in over 25 countries on site. And there's always the opportunity to partner with forward-looking companies on new programs, and we believe over time to build a end-to-end talent pipeline management solution. This is the idea of a service layer that goes on top of the entire employee life cycle, from being a candidate to being a promotion candidate to eventually continuing to develop and upskill in their career. I will close with just some brief insights on our experience so far. We have a large vision ahead of us, and we are still growing very rapidly, and we have lots of challenges that we want to conquer. But we've learned a few things over the past 5 years. What we have seen from all of our employer partners, as well as from our student population, is that talent is the key differentiator in the 21st century at all levels of the organization. It is not just about senior executives. It is about the depth of talent that you have, the ability to deploy small teams on big problems over and over again throughout your organization. The other is that digital transformations require both new talent to come in, as well as building capability within your organization and shifting that talent to appropriate places for the new challenges that occur as an industry shifts. We also have learned how to develop curriculum with the job in mind. Incredibly focused, tightly knit curriculums that are built in coordination with employers, understanding what are the core skills and the core rubrics that will be used to evaluate those employees' success. It's important to get clear on those competencies ahead of time, not require competencies that are irrelevant or credentials that are irrelevant, and then focus on both the ones that you need now and then understand the ones that you will need later. And again, as I said earlier, online learning alone does not solve that many problems. It's great to have access to content. It's a very powerful tool, but it is a tool. It lacks context and structure. There is huge value in in-person intensive learning and high levels of engagement to build true results for your company. And with that, I will say thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to the conversation.
Thank you. So Jake provided more time for discussion later on. So we will move on to the next speaker. Next speaker is Professor George Ip, who is a world-renowned professor of strategy and now co-director of a Center on China Innovation. But he has been all over. His education at Cambridge University in UK, and graduate education at Harvard University, and then he became professor at Cambridge and was a dean at many renowned schools. He was dean of Erasmus University Rotterdam School of Management. He also was associate dean of London Business School. For the last 4 years, he has been in China, while also having the association in UK. And I just learned that in June he will move back full-time to Imperial College London. So I look forward to listening to Professor Yip. By the way, in the plenary session, Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford University gave a very stimulating talk on the leadership BS. So I thought it was a Bachelor of Science, but he meant something else. So he gave a lecture on leadership crisis, what we needed to do better in leadership. After the session, he met with Professor George Ip, and he said, "Oh, you are the famous Professor George Ip." So I'm delighted to introduce Professor George Ip. Let us welcome him with a big round of applause.
안녕하세요. I hope I got that right. This is actually my 5th time in Seoul over the last 20 years, and Seoul is one of my favorite cities in Asia, so I'm very happy to be here again. Just to add a little bit more about my own background, although I obviously look Chinese, I'm ethnic Chinese, and I may sound a little bit British, I manage like an American, and this has been very confusing for people. But quite useful. At my deepest human resource experience was when I became Dean of Rotterdam School of Management, which was 500 faculty and staff and 7,500 students. So as HR people, you appreciate this. I was parachuted in at the top, never been there before, didn't speak the language, and had to undertake a strategic transformation in a culture that believed in consensus and a lot of discussion. And my approach, in fact, was to not have a lot of discussion, but to apply an action strategy to start doing things first in order to change people's minds after they do that. So actually a useful HR concept is that attitude follows action, not the other way around, and it is easier to get people to act their way into a new way of thinking than to think their way into a new way of acting. I attribute that to Richard Pascal, a former professor at Stanford Business School. Anyway, so that's just a bit of an aside about strategic change and management. Now, most of you are human resources executives, I believe, so I've good news and bad news for you. The good news is that human resources is now considered such an important function at global corporations that many of them are putting the head of HR on the corporate board. The bad news is that the person they're putting on the board is not an HR professional. So the challenge to you is how do you develop yourself sufficiently to be that person who's put on the corporate board. Now, my talk is actually about managing innovation in China, and I'll try to emphasize as much as possible the human resource aspects as I go along. I wonder if this is the right way. So for the last 4 years, at this center, we've been studying this topic. Is China creating the conditions for innovation? Are Chinese companies innovating, and in what ways? How is Chinese company innovation different from Western innovation? And a lot of that is related to HR and cultural characteristics. And what are Western companies doing, and what should they do about innovation in China? And this is the subject of a new book that's coming out in April, China's Next Strategic Advantage from Imitation to Innovation. So I'm really going to give you a brief summary of what we've been doing, and we've just completed the book. By the way, publishing is the last unreconstructed, modernized industry. We completed the manuscript and handed it in on the 1st of August. It will take 8.5 months for them to produce the physical book and also the electronic version either. So I think there's some opportunities to re-engineer that entire process. Just in brief, without giving you a lot of statistics, NSI stands for the National System of Innovation. And everything in China, is on the up. More scientific publications, etc., more patent applications, spending more money on technology, and so on. So now, in China, there's a lot of input into research and development. By the way, one way to think about the difference between research and development and innovation is that R&D turns money into ideas, and innovation turns ideas into money. So you have to complete that cycle in order to make money out of R&D. And again, HR professionals have a role to help that process of monetizing R&D via innovation. So what are the drivers of innovation in China? Why is China now an interesting place to do innovation? First of all, the customers in China are very different. With 1.3 billion people, huge amount of diversity. So it's not just the size of the market, but there's actually a lot of differences there. And then Chinese companies have a deep understanding of all the special needs of Chinese companies, which are surprisingly varied. And I'll give you some more examples later on. Secondly is the culture, both on the government side and on the company side. Chinese companies and leaders are very entrepreneurial. Interestingly enough, the most entrepreneurial companies are led by people who failed the elite education system in China. So I'm afraid there's evidence all over the world that people who go through the elite education system have the entrepreneurship ironed out of them. So companies like Alibaba, led by led by Jack Ma, and other innovative companies are led by people who are not part of that system. And of course, innovation is now a central plank of the Chinese government. Every time the Prime Minister talks, he talks about innovation as the way of moving China up and continuing their growth. Chinese companies are developing capabilities now through innovation, and China being such a large market, even a medium-sized company is a very large one by world standards, so they're generating a lot of cash in terms of what they can do. And this, they're putting money into innovation. So we looked at the history of innovation in China, and the first two phases. Phase one, the Chinese market economy is only about 35 years old. So they had to start from zero, really. And their initial approach was copying to fit for purpose. They just copied what Western and Korean and Japanese companies were doing, focusing very much on fit for purpose. And some of them were even doing it illegally, of course, and there's a phrase, shanzhai companies, which are bandit companies, but some of them have become legal companies, like Xiaomi, the mobile phone company, and one of the more innovative companies in China. And this was driven by the customers and the cultural aspects that I have mentioned. But then in a second phase, from being followers, they were pulled up, in particular, by participation in the global supply chains of foreign companies, Western companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies. This pulled up their quality, but it also pulled up their innovation. Right? And this, in turn, led them to develop their capabilities, generating a lot of cash. Now there's a third phase in which they're moving from this world standard to acquiring new resources and new knowledge. So in the last 10 years, Chinese companies have been making foreign acquisitions. Interestingly enough, they've had a lot of HR problems of dealing with the foreign workers. For example, when TCL, the Chinese electronics company, bought Thomson, the French company, they were shocked by two things. One is that the Chinese were very action-oriented, and they found the French company being very process-oriented. As the CEO said, when we were ready for action, the Europeans were still talking about process. The other thing is they weren't used to the working habits in France, the workers and managers going home at 5 p.m. Now, recently they've been acquiring resources such as oil, minerals, land, but now they've started acquiring brands, and more recently they've been acquiring companies for their technology. So Geely, a second-tier car company, bought Volvo a few years ago. Main reason to get hold of Volvo's technology. Sanyi, the largest construction company, equipment company in China, has recently bought a mid-sized German company, Putzmeister, to get access to their technology. So there are many examples like this where they're using acquisitions as a way of building up their capabilities. And one of the most interesting challenges for them is, one, they don't really have the capability to manage overseas because Chinese executives have really only worked in China, and they face a tremendous language gap problem, at least in the short term. Now, in the longer term, there's a second generation who've been educated in the West, and they are much better placed. But right now, they don't have that management capability. So they're tending to leave the foreign acquisitions alone. So let me talk about the 10 differences about the ways in which they're different. One is that compared with Western companies, they focus much more on local needs and the customers. I came across a great example. We visited TCL, the consumer electronics company. They showed us a dual TV set where two people can sit side by side and watch two different programs full screen. My theory is that they focus on the special need of the one-child policy, which is the one child grows up selfish, and when they get married, they don't want to share the TV program either. So it's a TV set to reduce the divorce rate. in China. Acceptance of good enough standards, which is hard for Western companies to do, but the Chinese have always focused on what exactly will sell there. Push for incremental, not radical innovations. So they don't worry about creating the next iPhone, but they will very quickly innovate around that. This can be summarized by this comment. Western, Japanese, and Korean companies may be very good at going from 0 to 1, creating a new category, but the Chinese are very good at going from 1 to 100. And you can make a lot of money going from 1 to 100. They're willing to supply special needs. One company, Hisense, has a big share of the TV market in Africa because many African villages can afford only one TV set, which has to be shown both indoors and outdoors. When you show it outdoors, you have to adjust the brightness. Only Hisense was willing to invest the engineering hours to create this capability and have the manufacturing capability to produce that product as well. Let me talk about 7 to 10 first, then I'll come back to the other two. So fast trial and error, they're willing to fail fast. So their culture, surprisingly you may think, is that they don't mind failing. They want to move on quickly. But the biggest mistake in China is to not do something. Less formal, faster processes. So Western companies in particular have very elaborate innovation processes, which usually take twice as long as Chinese innovation processes. And this is partly driven by intervention by the boss. So led by the boss, the CEO of one company said to me, I'm responsible for 95% of the innovations in this company, which is surprising if it's true, and even more surprising that he said it, because I don't think any Western CEO or Japanese CEO, and I'm not so sure about Korean CEOs, would even say something like that, even if they thought it. Right? I have a lot of experience of Chinese bosses myself. My father was a Chinese boss, and he once said to me, son, you should never contradict me, especially when I'm wrong. Of course, you don't have this problem of hierarchy in Korea, do you? And they're closer to the government and benefiting from government infrastructure programs. So let me go back to these other two aspects. I'll come back to that in a moment. So an example of Chinese innovation is a company called Broad, which started out making gas-fueled air conditioning systems, quite innovative, so successful now that they have installed these air conditioning systems in some US military bases in the United States. So that is quite an achievement. They have now moved to constructing buildings in a very typical Chinese manufacturing orientation. The buildings are manufactured rather than built. And I've been inside one of them as it was being manufactured. So steel frames, prefabricated panels, built-in and sealed air conditioning and heating systems, and going up very fast. And you can see that they sell it on a somewhat modular basis. You can choose a square building and a regular type or a step type. And they talk about designing it like an aircraft, lightweight, double safety, and so on. I actually saw a test bed where they tested it for withstanding earthquakes. And you could sort of increase the Richter scale test. And I saw them shaking the framework as they did that. They're also easy to install, and their analogy is that it's like Lego. Right, so that's a typical Chinese approach to innovation, incremental innovation, using process innovation, cost innovation, not a huge amount of technology, but becoming very effective and very profitable. So the Chinese go for pragmatic, profitable innovation. Now, I said I'd return to the two aspects that particularly relate to human resources. So another difference is that the Chinese use large numbers of staff to solve a problem. In manufacturing, they use large numbers of staff. In innovation, they use large numbers of staff as well. So the security vehicle market carries cash between banks and so on, is inherently a multi-local industry in that regulations are very different around the world, so the design is different around the world. And it's small batch production. So you cannot take the standard Chinese approach of a small number of global products manufactured centrally in a big factory and shipped around the world. But the CEO, who is a graduate of our university, of our business school, had a clever idea. He said, I will put 100 engineers to work for 1 year studying all the requirements around the world to look for commonalities, look at every component of these vehicles. So they found, for example, that with Windows, there are really only 4 designs, common designs. So now, for all the components, they manufacture like the 4 modules essentially, ship them around the world for final assembly. So using this large numbers of staff in R&D in order to transform an industry from multi-local to global. The other HR aspect, as you know, is that they work very hard in China. There is very little work-life balance in China. How's the work-life balance in Korea? Not so good either. Huawei, probably the most important company in China, telecoms equipment company, their slogan is the wolf spirit of Huawei. That tells you a lot about their corporate culture and their approach to human resources. So wolves work together in a pack, but with a strong leader. Interestingly enough, the CEO, the chairman, has a rotating CEO policy. The CEO changes every 6 months. Guess who retains the power? The chairman, when you're rotating the CEO every 6 months. So the wolf spirit of Huawei, guerrilla tactics, not necessarily following the rules. And if you just look underneath to the right, what do you see underneath there? A bedroll so that people can sleep in the office, either taking a nap or sleeping overnight. In fact, when I showed this picture in class a couple of weeks ago, a very successful CEO of another company said, yes, when I started out my business, I was sleeping in a bedroll under a bridge. So that's really a tough approach. So let me turn now to what foreign companies are doing in terms of R&D in China, and this includes Korean companies. They are now building more foreign R&D centers in China than anywhere else in the world. By 2008, it was 1,200 foreign R&D centers, and in fact, more than are being opened each year in the United States, because that has already happened. And our own projections show that by 2013, it was 1,500, and by 2018, it will be 1,800. And I'll explain these 3 types, cost-driven, market-driven, and knowledge-driven, in a few slides' time. Now, why are foreign companies coming to China for innovation? We can look at it in terms of the supply side and the demand side. So if we look at the HR aspects, first of all, talented and low-cost researchers, engineers, and scientists. As one European executive put it, in China, I can hire an engineer for the salary of a secretary in Europe. Now, what are they doing? They tend to hire top-level scientists who return from the West, pay them a very large salary, but then put underneath them a very wide pyramid, a bigger pyramid than the West, of Chinese salary level scientists and engineers. So again, using large numbers. And then support of the national and provincial governments. The provincial governments in China are very, very important. They compete with each other. So for example, one of the provincial governments supported the bid of Geely for Volvo. And of course, the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese. Now, the demand side is interesting as well. Obviously, it's easier to innovate into a fast-growing large market. That's straightforward. Second one, empty market spaces. Because China is a new market economy, a lot of spaces haven't been filled in yet. So IBM said to us, we love to innovate in China. When we come up with something new, we're not up against an installed base and legacy systems. On the B2C side, everyone is a first or at most a second generation consumer. So companies can really develop a new product, tell them how to use it. Like Philips created a new kind of iron for ironing clothes. Whereas in the West or in your countries, people might buy the products their mother used or their grandmother used, and so on. They don't have that. Market demand for simple, cheaper products, that means having to completely redesign the product, and fast-moving, large-scale government projects such as high-speed rail, airports. I live in England. England's been debating for 10 years whether or how to build a 3rd runway for Heathrow, and in the meantime, China's built 30 new airports in that time. And in terms of fast-scale government projects, I have a prediction for you. China will be the first country in the world to have a significant market for electric vehicles, because only China can quickly solve the chicken and egg problem of putting in charging stations. The government earlier this year announced they will put in charging stations all the way from Beijing in the north down to Guangzhou in the south. All right, so this will boost, and by the way, the standards will fit Chinese companies, not foreign ones. Now, there are many challenges for multinational companies. The first one is hiring and retention, something that you deal with. As you know, Chinese jump jobs very quickly, even for relatively small changes even for relatively small changes in salary. So, how do you hire and keep them? Protection of intellectual property rights is a big problem. They move slowly relative to the locals. Their standards are too high. And often, quality reduction or product pairing is just not sufficient. And I will show you an example of that in a moment. You can't just cut the product down. The process is too cumbersome, imposed by headquarters in a very risk-averse European or American way. Need for headquarters approvals. Now, these are challenges in all foreign countries, but much more so in China because of its size, its growth rate, and both its differences from the rest of the world and the differences within China. So major challenges for multinational companies. So we looked at the typical paths of evolution for MNCs, and each of those has HR implications as well. So foreign companies started to start with an R&D unit that I called a local server. It's focused on localization of the production process, using local materials, local labor force, and adapting the product so it can be produced at all. And this R&D server is embedded in and serves the local China organization, so very much reporting to the China business. Then over time, it tends to become an autonomous player, which has its own R&D program, with significant numbers of scientists and engineers, which, while serving the China business, also has a life of its own and some research programs. Where it starts to really get interesting is that they become a global network member with strong connections to HQ and the global R&D network. And you can see that at this stage, they're going to need world-class R&D people who can be respected by the rest of the global R&D network. And then even more so when they get to the fourth stage, the global mandate holder, where head office assigns specific projects to them to create knowledge for the entire world. Now, I'd mentioned an example of it being difficult to cut down the product. So this famous example of the General Electric ultrasound machine. On the left, they had a $150,000 machine for US hospitals. Too expensive for China, too complicated to use. You cannot just cut this down for the Chinese market. So they got the China business to redesign, really to design from zero, a handheld device at the $15,000 to $20,000 level for the Chinese market. This has been very successful in China, but in addition, it's been reversed out, it's called reverse innovation, back to the West, where it does not displace the big machine on the left, but has new uses, such as in ambulances and in doctors' offices. And interestingly enough, they could only do this with really a completely separate project team empowered in China. It could not be controlled from head office. Another example, a smaller example, this reading light by Philips is rechargeable because power supplies often break down in rural areas, and it lights only the book because Chinese homes are very small, and when someone is reading, they may disturb their spouse or their parents if it is a student. So a very Chinese characteristic. But again, now being sold in the rest of the world. Now, what are some of the barriers to evolution for multinational companies? So building up the local capabilities, hiring, retention, training, are things that are difficult to do. Another HR aspect, it's hard for the engineers in China, if you ask them to do something, say, for Germany, to really understand the needs in higher standards countries. So Korea, for example, has very high quality standards. Can a Chinese company really understand that? Thirdly, again, another cultural and HR problem, the home country engineers and scientists in the USA or Germany do not really value the local capabilities. They do not respect the Chinese capabilities. Fourthly, particularly in the European companies, they want to protect home employment. Zero growth in Europe, and labor union laws very hard to lay anybody off. And fifthly, unwillingness at headquarters to allocate resources to China and fear of loss of intellectual property rights and capabilities. So what can foreign companies do? These are some of the enablers that we found. As I said, bringing back Chinese scientists and engineers from abroad. The Chinese government has a couple of programs for this. The 1,000 Talents program and the 10,000 Talents program, which gives special privileges and status to returning scientists and engineers, obviously who are very eminent people. Secondly, and here a big role for HR, developing and implementing good policies for hiring and retention of Chinese staff. Interestingly, what Chinese staff particularly like are training opportunities and opportunities to train at head office. By the way, in Chinese companies, the head of human resources has a qualification that most of you don't have. They are very often usually a member of the Chinese Communist Party. So my own school is a joint venture between Europe and China. As a joint venture, we have a European president and a Chinese president, European dean, Chinese dean. The Chinese president, the Chinese dean, and the Chinese head of human resources are all senior members of the Communist Party. I have a small research team. One day, one of my researchers said to me, "Oh, George, I cannot come to the team meeting tomorrow." I said, "Why not?" "Oh, I have to go to the school Communist Party meeting." I didn't realize she was a member of the Communist Party. And I said, "What do you talk about in the school Communist Party meeting?" She said, "Oh, we talk about you." So a parallel all the way from the top down to the bottom, this parallel structure in Chinese companies. You have to understand that system in order to understand how Chinese companies work. So in fact, for me, I think one of the problems they're going to have when they go international, they can't really transfer this same system. Can they take the communist members, party members, to overseas? I doubt they'll be allowed to put a Communist Party branch within a US subsidiary, for example. In fact, when you apply for an immigration visa, you still have to answer the question, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party if you go to the United States? Although my favorite one is Russia. If you apply to go into Russia, they ask, do you have any knowledge of nuclear or chemical weapons? I've never been quite sure whether it's good to answer yes or no. So linking to Chinese universities, connecting to the Chinese innovation ecosystem, very important for that, creating a healthy linkage between HQ and China. I came across a very interesting HR-relevant example. One of the big European companies said, we have a designation called corporate scientist, which is above and separate from the regular job, and it gives them certain privileges, and they meet regularly. So it creates a global network of the top scientists in the company. The problem is, at the moment, we don't have a single corporate scientist from China. So we're really trying to push for that. And again, creating a healthy linkage as HR professionals, that the best way to do this is to transfer people. But normally, when you transfer people, they want to transfer someone who's the best for the new job. But of course, you want to transfer people for developmental purposes, right? So you want to transfer the Chinese executive to Germany or the Korean executive to Germany, even if they don't have the language skills, even if they're not such a good cultural fit. But this is an investment, and all of you should be responsible, now I'm talking more broadly than China, for these investments in creating globally capable executives, right? So don't just let the business units decide on the transfers. You must, as HR professionals, have a policy for transfer to build up. And it's easier in Korea because you are closer to lifetime employment than in Western companies. You can invest in that. Perhaps you don't go as far as Japanese companies one did. Before it sent young men overseas, it made sure they all got married. And they made sure that the women they married had a very important characteristic, which was that they could speak English, because then they would be happier when they were overseas. Because studies show the single biggest factor in the success of an expatriate assignment is the happiness of the trailing spouse. By the way, in Citibank, they even, for one nationality, allow you to bring your mother-in-law. This is Indians. And lastly, giving stronger autonomy to the China R&D operation, even setting up a China-based center with a global mandate. So, to summarize quickly what we have done, we also studied, I told you about this difference between cost-driven, market-driven, and knowledge-driven R&D centers. And early on, they do cost-driven R&D to reduce the cost of production. And this leads to low-cost, replicated products. Then later on, they move on to market-driven, where they're adapting the products, and a third stage, knowledge-driven. So Microsoft is a good example of knowledge-driven. In fact, let me just show you that example, where they came very early to China in order to tap into the scientists and the engineers. So not worrying about making products specifically for China, but creating knowledge for the entire world, connecting to the best universities. So we go back to these three types. Again, you need different types of people. For cost-driven, you might just have bachelors and masters working even in your R&D department. The second stage, market-driven, you need R&D managers who have some good understanding of marketing. And in the third stage, you need world-class PhDs, a mix of those who've been trained in the West, in Korea, in Japan, plus the local ones as well. Let me finish up this part of my formal presentation by broadening beyond R&D to talking about learning from China. China, as the fastest growing large economy in the world, as the largest population in the world, and really in many ways as one of the most diverse in the world, now with its unique customers and users, markets and competition, gives companies, foreign companies, a chance to really learn beyond R&D. The first one is bold experimentation and rapid iteration. Companies in the developed world are now old. The older the company, the slower it gets, and the more conservative it becomes, and they become risk-averse. Chinese companies are much less risk-averse, particularly the private ones. The state-owned ones are more risk-averse, but interestingly, they are getting less and less profitable, while the private ones are getting more and more profitable. So by participating in China, you can learn how to be a bold experimenter again, how to try things quickly. Secondly, innovation through creative adaptation. I have a wonderful example for you from Haier, the major appliances company. When it went to the US market, it started with very small innovations, such as putting a wooden tabletop on the small refrigerators in college dorm rooms to double up as a desk. But more recently, they've had a greater innovation. They have created a refrigerator with 3 compartments with a third temperature, which is warmer than the ice box, but colder than the main box, in order to store the food that is the most important for Americans. Do you know what that is? Ice cream. So when you take it out of the third compartment, it is ready to eat immediately, because Americans don't like to wait. So it took a Chinese company to understand this characteristic of the American market, and it took a Chinese company to invest the engineering hours to create that and have the manufacturing capability to do that. This, of course, is the power of China, the combination of putting in the engineering and scientific hours and the manufacturing capability, creating completely new categories. Some of it may be ridiculous. So in China, one company is now selling million-dollar glasses, spectacles. No, they don't have Google Glass in them. All it is that they're embedded with diamonds. And you know who's buying it? Not women. The typical buyer is a middle-aged male who owns a coal mine. You have to be there to understand this kind of thing about China. Lean value focus, value being quality relative to the price. So, Western companies, I suspect Japanese and Korean companies also have, their products have gotten more and more complex. By the way, do you mind if I criticize Japan here for a moment? One of the reasons why the Japanese have totally lost out in the mobile phone market is that they made their phones so complicated that nobody else in the world could use them, whereas Apple made them so simple that anybody could use them. Right? And this is also an example of lean value. And the last one, which I saved for you in particular, is HR people. Japan has not been open to foreign executives, so has not been a learning ground for mixed teams and global leaders. China is very open to foreign executives, foreign managers, tremendous opportunity to learn how to manage. So to finish up, to paraphrase the Frank Sinatra song, now we say, Shanghai, Shanghai, if you can manage in Shanghai, you can manage anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George, for your outstanding talk. So now we have a good time for Q&A. And since I don't have any questions delivered to me, you can bring, but we will open up the floor for you to ask questions. So my only advice is make your question brief and to the point, relevant to the topic, so that we can have many Q&As. Thank you. Any question? Yes. So is there a microphone? Would you indicate to whom you are addressing your question also? Either Jake or George? Yes.
Hello, my name is Ji-Sung Kim from KAIST IP CEO, and I am very glad for have some time with a wonderful speech. So I have some question to Professor George Ip, and I'm a student that very interested in establish a new company, and when I debate, we always talk about the Chinese customers. So I want to ask you, what is the most important strategies to a new company to succeed in China?
That, of course, is a huge question. The first answer is that, depending on the category, you may or may not need a local partner. What is the purpose of a partner? A partner is to bring capabilities that you yourself do not have. So in the regulated sectors, you need a partner to have access to the government. Kentucky Fried Chicken, when they first started out, one of their partners was there just to get them real estate space to open up their very first store. So you've got to think about what exactly is the nature of your industry. So the answer does depend on the industry. The second thing is that the Chinese move extremely fast. You have to understand the speed of that. But I think, Jake is an entrepreneur. I'm just a professor. I don't know how to start up a company. He does.
Yeah. Oh, I have to push that. Okay. I was actually just in China for the first time to look at opening a General Assembly in Beijing, and I'm struck by the volume of people and opportunity in China, but I also think it requires an incredibly specific understanding of the local market. It is not, you cannot just take ideas that have worked in the United States or in Korea or in Japan and apply them to China. The dynamics between the individual and the state are different. The dynamics of what consumers value are different. The dynamics of what businesses value, if you're selling to businesses, is different. And all of those cultural differences and market differences add up to a unique market to build a business in. And I think that, that is the key. I think it also determines the success. There are a lot of companies that have tried to start or to go to China, and the ones that have succeeded have understand that the incredible specific market dynamics there, and the ones who haven't have tried to force their assumed market dynamics into the location, which does not work.
And those are really great comments. You also have to be ready for people to imitate you, including doing it illegally. Just an example of this, in China, they fake a lot of things, including fake Apple Store. The entire store is fake, not just the products. At the other end, people are selling fake eggs. Can you imagine that? They can make money, it costs them less to make a fake egg than to produce a new one. So that's a real one. So this is what you're up against.
While we solicit a second question from the audience, I do have a question. I picked this newspaper up early this morning. It's a Metro newspaper. It talks about Samsung Pay and how Samsung Pay is doing so wonderfully in the US compared to Apple. And it's a result of M&A by Samsung Corporation. They have bought a small company and use it for Samsung Pay, and it's hugely successful. So, I think China is doing a similar thing, George, right? M&A. So could you share your experience and observation on M&A and how it could help some companies to succeed.
Are you talking about mobile payments, or are you talking about mergers and acquisitions?
This is a mobile payment by merger and acquisition. So my question is general about M&A in general. What is the business strategy, and is it open innovation that you can borrow some innovation from outside and use it for industry development in China?
Well, of course, there is a lot of open innovation in China, and we've looked at that, of working with the participants in the ecosystem. On mobile payments, Alipay is very progressive on that. That's worth taking a look at. So much so that Santander, one of the biggest European banks, is trying to learn from them of how to do mobile payments. But last, you were asking about how to do mergers and acquisitions?
I think what he's saying is that Samsung had this success, although I don't know quite how successful it is yet. I haven't heard of it, so there's something there. But sometimes you can buy your way into an innovation, right? Where you can buy your, which I think we see all over the world. What are the dynamics of in China around that?
Many large Western companies are buying smaller Chinese companies that have innovated. But it's a standard problem of any acquisition by a large company of a very small one. You have to find some way of preserving what you've bought. You're the elephant. You've bought a mouse. You don't want to crush the mouse. And how do you hang on to the founders, etc. But this is a standard problem. You just have to manage it. And again, this is a big HR issue as well, of how do you retain the talent and the capability. In the US, one problem is that you make the sellers so rich they lose the motivation to keep working hard.
Thank you. Since Jake finished his talk first, we have many questions from audience to Jake. So I will ask some questions to Jake. So the one question the people ask is, isn't 3 months too short to train people to get a good job? How do you do it in such a short period?
Okay, well, I would say the question, isn't 3 months too short to get a job, has so many built-in assumptions to it. And you have to specify each one of these things. And I think some of the lessons of our innovation is that you ask those questions specifically as opposed to generally. It has been assumed for 50 years, 100 years, that a bachelor's degree should be 4 years in length. Why is that? Can anyone tell me a real answer? Why not 3 years? Why not 2 years? Why not 6 years? It is not a foregone conclusion that that's how long it should be. It is a pure product of history. And so we need to be very thoughtful of those things. So when we looked at, the question is what level do you want to graduate somebody at, and what is the value of getting them to that level for that individual, for the company, and for society at large? So we have chosen to get people to the level where they are qualified for their first junior entry-level job in development, okay, or in user experience design. It is incredibly possible to take somebody who has gotten a college degree, to give them enough literacy and tools in the core skills they need to get them that entry-level job, to allow them to differentiate themselves, show their passion, and be able to add real value to their employer upon joining that company. Now, we are not making masters of these crafts. These people could not go teach this skill after they've been there for 3 months. But the reality is the next stages of learning for these skills are learning by doing. But they cannot learn by doing if they can't get that first job. And what we have to do is build the bridge between that level of zero knowledge to enough knowledge. And so the real question is how much is enough knowledge? And what we think we've found is in about 3 months, you can get enough knowledge to qualify for that early level job where employers are excited to have you, you can add value, and you can start your next stage of learning journey. It's worth noting that like when I went to Wharton, The core courses, the core curriculum, the stuff that I remember, all happened in the first half of the first semester, which is about 12 weeks, right? After that, it was mostly repetition. Repetition while everybody was partying and looking for their job. That was what the most time was spent on at Wharton. So by compressing and accelerating that, I don't think there's a lot of sacrifice of learning. What there is a more efficient approach and a directed approach to what you can do afterwards, which increases the return on investment.
Okay, I have more questions, but I'll come back to you later.
Okay.
But I like to ask a question to George from the audience. This is a good question. In Korean culture, George, do you know Pali? So they hear the speed, everything fast in Korean culture. So in fact, Korea is known to be the only country in the world who used to receive aid from overseas. But after 50 years, we are now able to give aid to many developing countries. So it has been phenomenal what Korea has done in the past using Pali culture and that hard working and the innovation, creativity, and so on. So the question here is Korean companies have grown at an amazing speed, such as Samsung, LG, and although he didn't say Hyundai as well. So they did it. Now, China is fast approaching. Actually, it's a phenomenal speed at China also. So the question is, the worrisome question is, would China overtake Korea? That's number one. And number two is, how should Korea do better not to be overtaken?
Well, I mean, in absolute size, China is already many times the size of the Korean economy. You can't just help that because their population is more than 20 times greater than yours. Now, I think that your per capita income will stay ahead of China for decades still to come. I think the more important question is, will China overtake you in terms of technology, right, as a source of technology? And that's a more difficult one because they have the benefit of scale. So again, even though the average level of education will stay lower in China than in Korea for a long time, even if 5% of your people at the highest level, and it's 1% in China, that's still many, many more, 4 times more than here. So that's the challenge that you have, and also because they've got the cash to put in. So in fact, in yesterday's newspaper, you saw that China has just rolled out its first mid-sized jet to go up against Boeing and Airbus. Well, they've now overtaken Korea. Korea does not have a commercial jet aircraft to go against them. I've good news. There's one sector in which China is still surprisingly far behind, which is automobiles. So you are well ahead of them. And the reason is because automobiles are both an industrial product and a consumer product. On the consumer side, China doesn't have good drivers in that they're first and second generation drivers. They just want a living room on wheels. So, other extreme, Germany, the ultimate driving machine. Interesting, on the supply side, a German company told me that Chinese automotive engineers are not as good because German automotive engineers grew up being taken to the garage by their grandfather or father. And in China, they don't have this experience. So I'm not sure if that's the case in Korea. But you're going to have to fight very hard. Now, there are other countries that have stayed ahead, very small ones, like Denmark in Europe, by specializing. So I still recommend looking at the book by my doctoral supervisor, Michael Porter, The Competitive Advantage of Nations, of showing how, even as a small country, you can retain an advantage in selected sectors.
So China has been amazing. In fact, compared to India, which has as many people, but the progress has been very rapid. You mentioned earlier about Communist Party, some political system. Is compared to India, which probably is more democratic, and the people can fight over and even kill each other over differences. In China, maybe difficult to do so. So you think a political system through Communist Party helped propel the China's economy and development over the years?
It hurt it until 1978. Right? What a disaster the economy was until 1978. But once they started to open it up, I think the advantage of the Communist Party was that it was able to do top-down investment in infrastructure and other kinds of investments that democratic systems find hard to do, particularly in a very large country. Now, there are comparisons, of course. People have sometimes said perhaps China would have done as well under a democratic system, but you see the example of India, and when you've got a large and diverse country, it makes a big difference. I think the other advantage of the Chinese system, which is not so obvious, is that the people who get to the top of the Chinese Communist Party, and hence of the government and the state-owned companies, many of them are engineers. So China is run by engineers, and the United States is run by lawyers, and the United Kingdom by public relations people.
The other question is, you earlier mentioned about Chinese people being pragmatic, and they are not also afraid of failures and so on. Compared to Korea, we try to encourage entrepreneurship and the startup, job creation by starting a small, medium-sized company. But the biggest worry is about failing. Failure, especially stigma. I've been told that if you fail something, 3 generations can suffer. You, parents, and your children. How is different in China? I mean,
yes, I've been thinking about this since I'm ethnic Chinese from Hong Kong, and I've been working in China now for 4 years. And Chinese culture is not the same as Korean or Japanese culture, because people normally group the 3 together and think, oh, Chinese are very obedient, and so that's why they're not creative, etc. But actually, Chinese are different, certainly from the Japanese. I don't understand Koreans as much, but I've studied Japanese a lot. See, the Japanese are obedient whether they're being monitored or not, like the Germans as well. So if the traffic light is red for the pedestrians, they'll stand there and wait. Chinese are very obedient when they're being monitored or when they're with someone who has some sanctions over them, such as their family. But the Chinese are very disobedient when they're not being monitored. In fact, there's a Chinese saying, 上高往地远, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. Think about it organizationally. This is why Chinese companies are very control-oriented. If you don't monitor them, they will run around, break the rules, cheat, sell stuff out through the back door. But this has the positive side, which is that they're very entrepreneurial and they're not afraid of failure. And so now, you can't change your culture overnight. Although, interestingly enough, China has now, the big problem is the education system also in China, rote learning, etc., too hierarchical. China's government has recognized this, and now there's a program by Duke University, one of the top universities in the USA, has a program now to train Chinese educators on how to teach in a less hierarchical top-down way, in a more American, challenging kind of way. So as usual, America is teaching China how to beat America. But that's the American way.
Thank you. I have a question for Jake. My own question plus some questions from the audience. I think you are doing an amazing thing through General Assembly and placing good places of your graduates and building great global network. So you mentioned that you have campuses in 14 different places. Now, looking into Asia, you have Shanghai and other places, but what is lacking is like you don't have it in Tokyo, you don't have it in Seoul. So is there any reason why you chose other places over Tokyo and other?
I would say both Tokyo and Seoul are incredibly high on my list of cities where I believe this model of education would work. And I am over here partly to explore those opportunities. I would say that until this point, the reason we are not already there is because So far, we have managed to expand, but not substantially deviate from what we do. And there's a couple ways to deviate. One is to change the business model, but I believe language and the importance of localization of language in Seoul and Tokyo create the need for a different level of investment and commitment in that market in order to succeed. And when you're a startup, and we've been growing incredibly fast, so it's not like we had a dearth of opportunities to pursue. You have to focus on the opportunities that you can that are going to take the least of your management bandwidth, because that is your biggest, your most precious commodity, I would say. And so we are now sort of at a stage. We just announced our Series D financing of $70 million. We are at a scale with a management team where we can start to approach these markets that I believe are incredibly exciting. I'm excited to be in Seoul and discover that. I believe Tokyo also could be very interesting. And I think in some ways, the other reason we think it's interesting is because we think both of those markets are on the cusp of being able to really explode in this startup ecosystem. And I think one of the topics that's sort of been coming out is how do you innovate, how do you avoid failure, how do you do all this stuff? I think the secret is that failure is always terrible, right? Like nobody likes to fail. But what has happened in Silicon Valley is there's been a celebration of failure, and everybody wants to talk about that. But it's not, celebration of failure is a side effect. It is a consequence of an ecosystem where people are hungry to fund experienced entrepreneurs. And just because you failed doesn't mean you don't have experience. And somebody who's failed is more experienced than somebody who's never done it before, and so does not have the success or failure on their scorecard. And so what really is required is not a perception change. Nobody will like failure. Nobody wants to fail. Nobody believes they will fail. And frankly, fear of failure is a good reason. It keeps you motivated on those days where it looks like you might have to close and you don't want to, and you hustle and you find miracles, out of thin air. What's important is an ecosystem of support. It's having, capital support resources. It's having educational support resources like General Assembly. It's having a community of other entrepreneurs who've been through certain things and those certain stages and will mentor existing entrepreneurs. It's having examples of success to look up to and learn from. And to me, those are the things that you have to build, and it really starts from a grassroots organic perspective. And we've been lucky to talk to a lot of governments as we've gone around the world and seen that it is an ecosystem. We're not, sometimes governments will come to us and say, we want you to single-handedly build our startup ecosystem. And we say that's not what we do. You have to think of an ecosystem as a multitude of parts. That anyone in particular is not that expensive, but slowly over time you can build something meaningful if you invest in those little pieces and get it working on its own and supporting itself, like a habitat or natural ecosystem.
So, you've been very successful. You are expanding your General Assembly campuses, but nevertheless, although you're expanding, you are limited in the capacity, and so you have to maximize the input to output, the whole process. So, to produce very successful graduates of General Assembly who can find good jobs after 12-week education, you must select some good people in the beginning. So how, say, if you open in Korea, how would you select your students?
So we really, our selection criteria is based on motivation, goal alignment, and commitment. There are some basic abilities you need to have. You need to be facile with a computer. It helps to have enough experience with mathematics, that some of the logic problems of programming are for example, in web development, are doable. But I believe a lot of these skills that are in such high demand, they are not so difficult that we need to be a 1% admissions rate type of organization. In fact, that I think it goes against our mission, which is to build a global network of people. And create accessibility for this 21st century opportunity. So it's really about goals, it's about motivations, it's about being able to work with other people. It's about being able to take feedback and process it, and then to be able to take new methodologies for solving problems and synthesize and incorporate them into your framework.
The other question from the audience is, what about the soft skills? Do you teach soft skills?
We do teach soft skills. What I would say is that is sort of built into every one of our curriculums, very specifically. We teach how to think about career and career success, how to evaluate career opportunities. We teach about teamwork and collaboration. And we teach about, design thinking and managing the creative process in all of our curriculums. It's sort of part of what we teach. Because every one of our students has hands-on learning, dealing with several projects. Sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. And so by the end, they've built actual things. And I think, there was a talk in the keynote of how do we get more creative people and creative thinkers. And I think this action concept is so important here, is that it's not about creative thinking. Creative thinking is great, but you learn creative thinking by creative doing and creative making. And the experience of making things, of getting your hands around a problem and having to solve it because you have no other choice, is the best training for how to then do it again, and how to teach other people how to do that. And so that is really at the heart of the curriculum of General Assembly, the spirit of General Assembly, is to teach people how to jump into the fire, have to solve the problems in real time, make actual things, and then look back on that experience and extract lessons that make you better at it the next time.
Yes, question, please. And then another question, yes. Is there a microphone? Yes. Oh, okay, so first.
Sure. Rhett Miller from the University of Sydney. My question is to George. Given the importance of state-owned enterprises to the Chinese economy, what role are they playing in that innovation ecosystem? Is a lot of this R&D and innovation coming from them, or is it coming from sort of a small and medium-sized enterprise base?
Innovation is coming across the board. I mean, the large state-owned enterprises have a lot of money. So, for example, Comac, the company that has launched the jet against Boeing and Airbus, is a state-owned company. The train companies that are selling high-speed trains are state companies. So, the biggest difference between the state-owned and the private is that, the state-owned companies are using scale and volume. If you don't mind my saying so, they're using sumo strategy of innovation, and the private companies are using judo strategy of innovation, of being more creative about that. By the way, this is my recommendation for Korea. You have to move from sumo strategy to judo strategy.
Judo.
I mean,
or taekwondo.
I think one of the most interesting lessons, when I was just in Beijing, the thing that blew me away was WeChat, right? And I had never even really, I didn't even understand what WeChat was or what a big deal it was until I went over there. And within a couple days, it is probably the most impressive platform I've seen. The ubiquity of usage, the UX, it's not pretty, but it works and everybody uses it. And to think that came out of by the way, it came out of a relatively mature company that has had several, different levels of success over different things. But it didn't come out of a telecom giant, right? It didn't come out of Japan or NTT Docomo. It didn't come out of Samsung or Korea. It didn't come out of the United States. And in some ways, you could argue that any single piece of it is not an innovation, right? It's not. It's all the same stuff that every other application has. But by combining it a certain way, they had a new approach to the idea of a platform. And by understanding the local market forces, they were able to build a ubiquitous platform, which then gives them real market power. And so I think innovation is such a weird word. I don't really understand what innovation means. I think innovation is the idea of taking new ideas, old ideas in new frames, and putting them into action in ways that actually work, right? And for companies, innovation typically means doing something different than what you've always done before, which is the inertia of any organization of any size, whether you're 100 people or 100,000 people. And so, you know, that to me is sort of the real key. And what you see is that the big state-owned enterprises are able to move immense mountains because they have the capital and the support and the scale on the other side of it. So that's huge. So, you know, you're not gonna see like a scrappy startup build an airliner, right? It's just not gonna happen. But that's not to say that it isn't innovation. To figure out how to build your own airliner, like if you've never had a national industry in it, that's hard. You got to hire a whole bunch of new people. You got to think about designs. You got to consider what the market entry strategy is, which is necessarily going to involve some kind of differentiation. So that's really interesting. But then all the little firms are fascinating too because they are going at lightning pace and they are customizing now for the China market. And the China market is big enough that it counts on its own, and so then everybody else around the world has to pay attention, right? I wouldn't be surprised if we all end up using WeChat and Tencent, you know, owns a little bit of money from every one of us every month because of that. And so that's the dynamic of innovation is really all of these different, it's the ebbs and flows of business and of market power, and it's fascinating, but it's a combination of creativity and execution. It's the creative action, not the creative thinking.
Yeah, thank you. So we have, I think, 2 more questions. Yes, so question?
Okay, Hyun Jung from the Korea Economic Daily. So my question is, nowadays Xi Jinping's administration, they already proclaimed the new normal, it's a 신常态. So that's why they, after proclaiming those kind of focusing on they're more government more focusing on the desiring to protect the home employment, and also they're encouraging their citizens domestic expenditure as well. But in Korea, and also you mentioned, as you mentioned before your presentation, also you mentioned the innovation through the creative adaptations. So, but in Korea, it's a lot of younger people, so they want to do their start a company and also the entrepreneurship as well. So they are dreaming and the bets, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent as well. So how you gonna those kind of situation now, but going to the China to business, to the incubating those kind of things in your government systems nowadays?
So there's interest among young people in Korea to maybe do potentially a business in China, start a company in China. So what is your advice for those people to do such a thing in China?
Well, as we said to the earlier question, you can't just go to China with no background and no knowledge. If they want to do it, it's extremely difficult. Maybe they can start out by working for the Korean subsidiary of a Chinese company, and then go to China and work for the Chinese subsidiary of a Korean company. But they can't just go there from zero. And as a minimum, they need to know how to speak Mandarin, really.
Yes.
And I don't know how many Koreans can speak Mandarin.
Right, so I know one company who hired a Chinese experience, and then they are doing business in Shanghai and seems to be doing extremely well because he knows in and out of all this political system and the networking and so on. So I think what George is telling you is a very, very good advice.
I think the other thing I would say is this is what we were talking about earlier. Market knowledge for an entrepreneur is everything. There are ideas that I will have about the United States that because I've lived there and I work there, it's in your bones that you know what consumers will buy and won't buy and what will work and won't work. When you go to a new market, you immediately have to assume that you don't understand the consumer. And you have to be humble in front of that and frankly be very, very careful, which is why we're not just jumping into China or any of these markets, right? We will probably go in with partners that have local market knowledge. If you really want to start, what I think everybody's saying is China's the big market. China's the exciting market. I'm in Korea, I'm right here. If I'm gonna start a business, I wanna go to China. And what I would say is the better strategy would be start something that is meaningful in Korea, that you at least have a view into why it might work in China, and then get it working, get traction in Korea, and then find a partner in China to take it to China. And maybe you can charge licensing fees, which is the best, most profitable business model in the world anyway. So to me, focus on the market you know. It's very, very hard to build for markets you don't know.
Okay. Thank you. So we have now 40 seconds. So maybe I give you 20 seconds each for you as a last comment, please. George.
Well, I think that everything that we've said here is very relevant to you as human resource professionals. And there's a huge challenge of transforming and upgrading the capabilities of Korean students and of Korean executives. Particularly now, you have so much more competition from China. So just sum it up, Korea has to learn faster than China to stay alive.
Thank you. George. Jake? Yes.
Yeah, I would say I think there's huge opportunity in Korea. Amazing resources of talent and corporations and experience. But it is going to take a forward thinking and an awareness of the competitive ecosystem that we're in. I would say, that is, General Assembly loves fueling that kind of ecosystem. I'm here partly to learn about what Korea needs and what are the challenges of Korean companies, Korea talent pipeline, and Korea education. So to the extent that people want to talk to me and I want to learn what it's like to do HR in Korea. I want to learn how it is to hire talented graduates and to compete in the new digital economy.
Thank you. In closing, I'd like to thank your attendance as well as the two speakers who gave outstanding, excellent comments and the guidelines and also sharing of their observation and experience. So let us ending this session by giving a big round of applause.